Jonah Kincaid only meant to open his father's diner long enough to sell it for whatever a buyer would pay, just enough to keep a roof over his daughter's head after losing his job. But on the very first morning, a man in a tailored suit walked through the door, set a cheap check on the counter, and told him the town would bulldoze the place before summer anyway. That night, while Jonah pried up rotted boards in the old pantry, his crowbar struck metal. Beneath the floor sat a locked steel box stamped with his father's initials and the crest of the Carrington family, the very people trying to take the diner out from under him. If you love stories where the person everyone underestimated ends up making the powerful kneel, hit subscribe and stay until the end. The funeral had ended only 3 days earlier when Jonah pulled into the gravel lot behind Kincaid's diner for the first time in nearly 7 years. The sign above the door hung crooked, half its letters faded to ghosts, and dust lay thick across the counter where his father used to pour coffee before sunrise. Jonah had grown up in this building, had learned to crack eggs and flip pancakes here before he learned to ride a bike. Yet he had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to get as far from it as possible. He found stacks of unpaid bills shoved into a drawer, a county notice threatening to seize the land over back taxes, and a bank letter warning that foreclosure proceedings would begin within the month. His phone buzzed before he had even finished reading the third letter. It was his daughter, Willa, 17 years old and far too perceptive for her own comfort, asking if they were going to lose the rented house they currently called home. Jonah told her not to worry, the way fathers do when they have nothing solid to offer beyond reassurance. He had recently lost his job repairing industrial kitchen equipment when his company trimmed half its technicians, and the severance check was already thinning out. His first instinct, standing in that dust-choked dining room, was to list the building for sale and leave Bellwether, Pennsylvania behind for good. Then Harlan Pike walked in, an old man with flower-white hair who had cooked beside Walter Kincaid for more than 30 years. He set a folded apron on the counter, the same one Walter had worn for decades, and said quietly that the old man would never have wanted this place sold to the Carringtons. Jonah looked past him through the front window and saw the skeleton of a massive resort rising across the street, cranes turning slowly against the gray sky, swallowing the horizon his father used to watch every morning. Something in that image settled into Jonah's chest like a stone. He told himself he would give the diner 30 days, enough time to patch the roof, fix the wiring, and see if the doors could open again. If it failed, he would sell without looking back. He told himself this was about proving he was nothing like the stubborn, broke old man who had died alone in a building nobody else wanted. He did not yet understand how wrong that judgment of his father would turn out to be. A black SUV pulled into the lot 2 days later, its tires crunching gravel like a verdict already decided. Jonah was elbow-deep in a corroded exhaust fan when the door chimed, and a man in his 50s walked in without waiting to be invited. His name was Graham Halstead, the head of development for Carrington Crown Hospitality, and he wiped down a chair with a handkerchief before sitting, as though the dust itself might be contagious. Graham placed a check for $85,000 on the counter, a figure far below what the land was actually worth, and suggested Jonah take it before the building embarrassed itself any further. He called Kincaid's diner a grease museum and referred to Jonah as an out-of-work appliance repairman clinging to sentiment he could not afford. He explained, almost bored, that the Carrington Meridian Resort needed this exact stretch of land to finish its southern access road and landscaping, and that the city would never approve a reopening permit given the building's outdated wiring and plumbing. Jonah asked the obvious question: why would a billion-dollar company send its head of development to personally negotiate for one broken-down diner? For a moment, something flickered behind Graham's composure. A flash of irritation quickly smoothed over, and he raised the offer to $100,000 on the condition that Jonah sign immediately. Jonah tore the check in half and slid the pieces back across the counter. The very next morning, a city inspector named Dean Barlow arrived with a clipboard listing violations that hadn't existed during any previous inspection of the property. Within days, a few shop owners on the block began making comments about knowing one's place when a family like the Carringtons wanted something. Jonah ignored them and kept working, replacing pipe after pipe in the kitchen, until one evening he noticed Harlan staring at a section of the pantry floor with unusual intensity. The old cook mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Walter had once forbidden anyone from repairing those particular boards, despite the wood being clearly rotted through. That detail nagged at Jonah for the rest of the night. While replacing a water line beneath the same section of flooring, his crowbar struck something that did not sound like wood. A hollow metallic thud that sent a chill through him before he understood why. He pulled the boards away one by one and found a section of thin concrete poured over a narrow cavity, clearly added long after the original foundation. Beneath it sat a fireproof steel box, slick with preservation oil and wrapped loosely in a cloth napkin bearing the Carrington crest. Stamped into the lid were two sets of initials, WK and AC, pressed into the metal like a signature meant to last. No key Jonah owned would open the lock, and he spent nearly an hour trying every old key he could find around the building. Harlan finally remembered something, a silver coin Walter had always kept tucked inside the antique cash register, refusing to spend it no matter how tight money got. Jonah pried open the drawer and found a small brass key taped beneath that very coin. Inside the box lay a photograph from 1987, showing a younger Walter standing beside a man named Augustus Carrington outside a small, struggling restaurant. There was a property deed, a stock certificate, a stack of bank correspondence, and a sealed envelope with Jonah's name written across the front in his father's handwriting. The letter inside held only a single line: "Before you sell this place, ask them why their resort only has one legal road in or out." Jonah pulled out a county map and traced the narrow strip of land running behind the diner, realizing it extended directly into the construction site of Carrington Meridian. An old agreement permitted Carrington to use that strip for a token fee, but the right could apparently be revoked if the family ever pressured the Kincaids into selling. The stock certificate stated plainly that Walter owned 3% of Augustus Carrington's original company, though the paperwork lacked any record showing how that stake had carried forward through decades of corporate restructuring. Jonah didn't know what to make of any of it. Was his father a swindled victim, a forgotten founder, or simply an old man who had hoarded worthless paper out of stubborn pride? He was still turning the documents over in his hands when his phone buzzed with a text from Graham Halstead. "Don't believe everything an old man hides under his floor." The next morning, Jonah carried the documents to Mara Ellison, a real estate attorney who had built her reputation in Bellwether on patience rather than flash. She examined the ink, the notary stamps, and the paper stock, confirming everything matched materials common to the late 1980s. Still, she warned him that a stock certificate alone proved very little without a clear chain connecting it to the company as it existed today. The access road, however, was the more urgent problem. If the deed still held legal weight, Carrington Meridian had no lawful fire department or supply route onto its own property. Mara advised Jonah to stay quiet about everything he had found until they understood exactly what they were holding. Together, they visited the county records office and discovered the original deed referenced in digital archives had apparently been replaced at some point during a records digitization project, the page numbers no longer matching the bound originals in storage. Graham responded with a new offer of $300,000, this time demanding Jonah surrender every document connected to his father in exchange. Jonah refused again. A local news article soon painted him as a bitter heir blocking hundreds of promised jobs out of greed, and townspeople who had never read a single page of the documents began treating him like an obstacle rather than a neighbor. Vivian Carrington, the company's chief executive, appeared in a television interview shortly after, declaring the company would not bow to claims built on, in her words, sentimental family keepsakes. Jonah felt that insult settled deep, a stranger dismissing his father's life's work as nothing more than nostalgia. He announced publicly that the diner would open on schedule, no matter what Carrington wanted. Mara, digging further through old corporate filings, found something that made her pause. Graham Halstead's name appeared in the restructuring records from the very year Walter Kincaid's name vanished from the shareholder list. Harlan finally told the fuller story one evening as they painted the dining room walls. Back in 1987, Augustus Carrington wasn't yet wealthy, just a young restaurant owner on the verge of losing everything, refused by every bank because he had already mortgaged what little he owned. Walter sold his delivery truck and emptied his savings to lend Augustus $42,000, and in return received 3% ownership in the business, along with a clause protecting that stake from ever being diluted. Walter never wanted a seat at the boardroom table. He simply wanted to keep running his diner and raising his family, content to let his small investment grow quietly in the background. As Carrington's empire expanded, Walter received only modest annual payments labeled as consulting fees, a fraction of what 3% ownership should have actually returned. When Augustus passed away, those payments stopped entirely, and Walter's letters demanding an explanation were repeatedly stalled by the company's legal department. Graham, then a young attorney working for Carrington, eventually sent Walter a document claiming his ownership had been exchanged for a final lump sum payment. The signature on that waiver, Jonah now realized while comparing it to other family papers, did not match his father's actual handwriting at all. Jonah remembered, with a fresh and aching guilt, how Walter had spent his last years insisting the Carringtons were trying to steal something that belonged to him, and how Jonah had quietly dismissed it as the rambling of a tired, bitter old man. The truth landed harder than any insult Graham had thrown at him, because this time the person Jonah had failed to believe was his own father. Mara uncovered bank records showing a shell company had received a payment timed precisely with the appearance of that suspicious waiver, a shell company with financial ties leading directly back to Graham Halstead. Jonah understood then that Graham wasn't merely chasing a parking lot. He needed that steel box to disappear before Vivian or the board of directors ever laid eyes on it. The following day, an assistant called to inform Jonah that Vivian Carrington intended to visit the diner herself the next morning. She arrived with 2 attorneys and a pair of security escorts while Jonah was still elbow-deep repairing a ventilation fan. She did not offer a handshake, only set a property valuation file on the counter and proposed $750,000, considerably higher than before, paired with a strict confidentiality agreement. She argued that a closed-down diner had no right to threaten the livelihoods of hundreds of resort employees. Jonah answered that a billion-dollar company had no right to build its future by erasing the name of the man who once helped it survive. Vivian insisted his father had already been compensated and dismissed the stock certificate as a piece of paper with emotional rather than legal weight. Jonah set the old photograph of Walter and Augustus on the counter between them, and Vivian's eyes lingered on the wristwatch. Augustus wore in that image a watch she recognized from her own family's safe, proof the photograph had never circulated publicly before. Harlan brought out a slice of apple pie made from Walter's original recipe and set it gently in front of her. Something in the gesture seemed to loosen Vivian's certainty. She recalled, almost involuntarily, her grandmother once mentioning a man named Walter who had saved Augustus from ruin, a story the family had always quietly steered away from discussing further. Still unwilling to concede anything in front of her own staff, Vivian held her composure. Jonah pointed out the clause regarding the fire access road, reminding her he had not yet revoked the right, though nothing stopped him from doing so. For the first time she went quiet. She asked what amount of money he wanted. Jonah told her he didn't yet know how much they owed his family, so he wasn't about to hand her a number just to buy his silence. Before climbing back into her car, Vivian paused and looked at the crooked old sign longer than she probably intended to. Minutes later, Graham called Jonah directly, his voice flat and cold. "You just turned a real estate transaction into a war you cannot afford to survive." What followed felt less like business and more like a siege. The bank notified Jonah that his outstanding tax debt had just been purchased by an investment firm, and Mara quickly traced that firm back to a subsidiary connected to Carrington Crown Hospitality. Inspector Dean Barlow returned with an entirely new list of violations that had not existed during his first visit. The power company shut off service to the diner, citing unsafe wiring, and a supplier canceled an order after hearing rumors the building might soon be sealed off completely. Graham leaked a distorted story, claiming Jonah was demanding tens of millions of dollars from the company, further turning public opinion against him. A small crowd gathered outside one afternoon, urging Jonah not to sabotage a project promising hundreds of local jobs. Jonah said nothing in his own defense. He kept sanding chairs, kept repainting walls, kept polishing glasses as though opening day remained exactly on schedule. Willa offered to delay her college plans to help cover the mounting bills. Jonah refused immediately, telling her that a father's job was to clear a path forward for his child, not drag her back into cleaning up old mistakes. Quietly, without any announcement, Harlan and a handful of longtime regulars began showing up after hours to help however they could. When the diner finally opened its doors for a trial run, it filled with customers who remembered Walter and wanted to support his son. Just as the kitchen hit its stride, an inspector arrived and taped an emergency closure notice across the front window. Graham watched from across the street, then sent one final offer, $1 million, due before midnight. Mara warned Jonah that without the original shareholder ledger, any claim to the stock would remain incredibly difficult to defend in court. That night, Jonah sat alone in the pantry beside the steel box, noticing it still felt heavier than it should after every document had already been removed. He tapped the bottom panel and heard a hollow echo where solid metal should have been. Using a screwdriver, he lifted the felt lining, and discovered the box had a false bottom. Beneath it lay a single page from the original shareholder ledger, stamped with the official seal of the Carrington Founding Company. Walter Kincaid's name appeared clearly beside the 3% ownership stake, accompanied by a handwritten clause stating the share could not be revoked without the direct signature of the shareholder himself. Alongside the ledger page sat a payment record book, a confirmation letter from Augustus Carrington, and the original right-of-way permit for the access road. Walter had hidden this single page separately, anticipating that company records might one day be altered or destroyed. Jonah also found a long, final letter tucked beneath everything else, but he chose not to read it yet, determined to settle the legal truth before he allowed himself to face the personal one. Mara contacted the archive department of a bank that had merged repeatedly over the decades and confirmed Walter had indeed transferred $42,000 to Augustus, later receiving profit distributions for 14 consecutive years. A preserved microfilm reel from the county courthouse matched the property deed found inside the box exactly. Harlan signed a sworn statement confirming he had personally witnessed Walter and Augustus finalize their agreement inside the very diner where he now stood. A retired notary named Evelyn Price verified both the seal and signature as authentic. The chain of evidence no longer rested on a single fragile document. Meanwhile, Vivian ordered an internal investigation and discovered Graham had deliberately removed every reference to Walter Kincaid from the legal reports submitted to the board. When confronted, Graham insisted he had simply protected the company from what he called an insignificant claim. Vivian understood instantly that if this story became public, the company could face accusations of fraud, stolen equity, and false statements to investors. She suspended Graham on the spot, though several board members still pushed to pressure Jonah into selling before the truth spread any further. Mara filed an emergency court motion blocking any demolition and halting the opening permit for Carrington Meridian until the matter was resolved. The court agreed to schedule an urgent hearing. Soon after, Jonah received a formal invitation to appear before a special session of the Carrington Board of Directors. Mara reminded him plainly that he was about to walk into a room filled with people wealthier than the entire town combined. But this time, they were the ones who needed his signature. Jonah arrived at Carrington's headquarters wearing the same worn jacket he wore at the diner, the steel box carried under one arm like an ordinary toolbox. One board member asked, with thinly veiled condescension, whether he understood this was a corporate meeting rather than an antiques fair. Jonah said nothing in response. He simply set the steel box down in the center of the long, polished table. A company attorney announced that the diner itself was worth roughly $90,000 at most. Mara replied calmly that they had not come to discuss the value of a building, but to establish who actually owned a portion of the company sitting in that room. An independent auditor confirmed Walter's original investment was genuine, that the waiver renouncing his ownership carried a forged signature, that the anti-dilution clause remained legally enforceable through every corporate successor, and that the company had been using Kincaid land without honoring the original agreement. A fire safety consultant then informed the board that Carrington Meridian could not receive its occupancy certificate without legal access through the strip of land behind the diner. A $420 million project now faced indefinite delay. Several of the same people who had mocked Jonah weeks earlier suddenly avoided meeting his eyes. Graham, joining remotely, tried shifting blame onto Walter, But Jonah produced the stack of letters his father had written over the years, each one ignored or buried by the company's legal team. Vivian publicly acknowledged the forged waiver held no legal standing. The board offered Jonah $12 million to settle every claim, purchase the land, and ensure his silence going forward. To the shock of everyone present, Jonah turned the offer down. He reminded them of the $85,000 check Graham had once slid across his counter, calling the diner a grease museum not worth saving. He told them, plainly and without raising his voice, that he would not let them assign a price to his family's worth ever again. The chairman finally asked what exactly Jonah wanted. He closed the lid of the steel box, looked around the table, and said simply that tomorrow they should come to the diner instead. This time, they would be the ones sitting on the other side of the counter. The following morning, Vivian and a handful of board representatives arrived without their usual entourage of security and assistants. Jonah poured coffee into the same chipped porcelain cups his father once used for every customer who walked through the door. Then he laid out exactly what he expected in return for resolving everything peacefully. He asked for full restoration of the Kincaid family's 3% ownership stake. He asked for payment of every profit distribution withheld over the years. He asked the company to publicly acknowledge Walter's role in its founding history. He insisted Kincaid's diner could never again be threatened with forced demolition. He required Carrington to fund the long-overdue repairs to the neighborhood's outdated electrical, water, and fire safety systems. He proposed a support fund for longtime employees affected by the resort's rapid expansion, and he asked that the access road remain available at a fair fee rather than being shut off out of spite once the dust settled. Jonah did not demand Vivian's resignation, recognizing she had inherited this mess rather than created it, though he made clear she now bore the responsibility of fixing it. Vivian offered her apology without excuses, admitting her family had built part of its empire by erasing a man too poor to defend himself at the time. The board accepted every term, understanding it was both the right thing to do and far less costly than a public legal battle that could devastate the company's reputation. Graham was formally terminated, his records forwarded to investigators. The closure order against the diner was reconsidered once it came out that Inspector Dean Barlow had received improper instructions from above. Jonah did not become a billionaire that day, but his restored ownership stake, combined with the back payments, secured a stable future for Willa that he had once feared was impossible. Still, he chose to finish restoring the diner with his own two hands rather than hand the work off to anyone else. Once everyone had left, Jonah finally sat down alone and opened the long letter his father had hidden beneath the false bottom of the steel box. Walter apologized for keeping the truth buried for so long. He explained that most of the money from his final years had quietly gone toward covering medical expenses for Jonah's late wife, a sacrifice he never mentioned because he didn't want his son to carry the weight of that debt. He admitted his greatest failure wasn't losing his stock or his savings, but believing for so long that silence would somehow protect the people he loved. He understood that Jonah might never love the diner the way he once had, and he didn't ask him to keep it. He only hoped his son wouldn't sell the place before discovering his own true worth. The final line of the letter read simply that the diner had never truly been his inheritance. The real inheritance was the right to stand tall when powerful people tried to force him to his knees. Months later, Kincaid's diner reopened its doors for good. The original sign was carefully restored rather than replaced with something new and shining. Harlan returned to the kitchen, this time as a trusted advisor rather than a line cook. Construction workers from the Carrington Meridian site became some of the very first regular customers. Vivian arrived alone one morning, stood patiently in line like everyone else, and paid for her breakfast without ceremony. A small plaque now hung on the wall, recognizing Walter Kincaid as a founding investor of the company across the street. Willa came home for the grand reopening and watched her father standing behind the counter, wearing the same apron Walter had worn for decades. Jonah never bragged about the settlement, never mentioned the boardroom showdown to a single customer who walked through the door. The steel box sat displayed inside a glass case behind the register, completely empty now. When a curious customer once asked what had originally been kept inside, Jonah simply answered that it once held something powerful people had hoped a poor man would never find. He flipped the sign on the front door to open. The coffee machine hissed to life. Morning light spilled across booths that had once been buried under years of dust, and the seats slowly filled with familiar faces. For the first time in his adult life, Jonah no longer felt like he was living in his father's shadow. He finally understood that Walter hadn't left him a dying diner at all. He had left him proof that a name erased from the record books could still rise again, as long as someone brave enough was willing to open the box and speak the truth out loud.